The blood on Emmett's knuckles was already flaking off like old rust, dropping into the sterile, white marble of the royal palace. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this corridor, not smelling the heavy, coppery tang of opened arteries, and certainly not holding a standard-issue military blade. He was a tutor. He was paid a very generous amount of credits by the High Chancellor to teach a spoiled alien princess how to steep Terran tea, how to calculate planetary logistics, and how to understand the complex rhythm of ancient human poetry. He was supposed to be soft now. He had spent 7 long years trying to bury the ghost of the man he used to be in the trenches of Proxima Prime. But looking down at the matte black tactical boots of the mercenary he had just dropped in the dark, Emmett realized something chilling. You can take the soldier out of the mud, but when you touch what's his, the animal wakes up hungry. 2 hours earlier, the atmosphere in the high-tier palace atrium was completely different. The air scrubbers hummed quietly behind vaulted walls, pumping out a sharp, clean scent of crushed mint and artificial ozone, the signature smell of the planet's upper elite. Emmett stood before a massive, old-fashioned smart slate. He held a piece of raw calcium chalk between his thick, calloused fingers. In a galaxy dominated by holograms and neuralinked data pads, Emmett preferred the dry, physical scratch of chalk against a dark board. It grounded him. It reminded him of a time before the universe became cold metal and plasma fire. He dragged the white tip across the slate, drawing a crude map of the inner trade colonies. The fundamental flaw of the Orion trade agreement, Emmett said, his voice a slow, gravelly baritone that dragged across the room like boots over gravel, wasn't the economic tariffs, princess. It was the logistics. The planners assumed uniform distribution of fuel across the rim worlds. They looked at numbers on a screen, not the actual speed of cargo freighters under heavy gravity. Behind him, a heavy, theatrical sigh echoed through the room. Princess Isabel slumped deeply into her oversized hoverchair. Her pale, faintly luminescent skin caught the harsh light of the twin suns shining through the towering stained-glass windows. She had 4 slender, delicate fingers on each hand, currently occupied with picking at the frayed hem of a faded denim jacket. It was a cheap human garment she had begged Emmett to order from an off-world black market catalog because she thought it made her look authentically Terran. Her secondary eyelids, thin and milky, flicked horizontally in pure, unadulterated teenage boredom. Emmett, we have been over the Orion logistics 3 times this week, she grumbled. Her vocal cords produced a strange, beautiful layered harmonic tone, a biological trait of her species that made her sound like she was speaking through a high-end audio chorus pedal. It's boring. The outer world starved, the people got angry, the trade routes collapsed. The end. Can we please go back to the Terran romantic sonnets? At least those have passion. Emmett stopped writing. He turned around, wiping the white chalk dust onto his worn, brown corduroy slacks. He offered her a small, tired, unassuming smile. To anyone looking through the palace security cameras, Emmett looked exactly like what his resume claimed, a 30-something human academic with premature gray hair dusting his temples. A slight academic slouch, and eyes that always seemed to be focusing on something 1,000 yards away. He looked harmless. He looked like the kind of man who would apologize if you bumped into him in a corridor. Logistics win wars, Isabel, Emmett said softly, stepping closer to her desk and leaning his weight against his knuckles. Poetry. Poetry just tells us how to feel about losing them. If you don't understand how the food and fuel move, you don't understand how your own people survive. Your father expects you to run this sector one day. The sound didn't register as an explosion at first. Not to a civilian mind. It started as a sudden, violent drop in air pressure. A vacuum so intense it sucked the oxygen straight out of Emmett's lungs and caused his eardrums to pop with a sickening click. In the fraction of a second that followed, the massive, 60-foot stained-glass windows behind Isabel's desk bowed inward, flexing like thin plastic under an impossible weight. Then, they disintegrated. Millions of multicolored glass shards turned into a lethal, supersonic horizontal rainstorm, slicing through the air with a terrifying shriek. Emmett didn't think. He didn't calculate a trajectory or analyze the threat. 7 years of quiet, peaceful academia vanished in a microsecond as his buried survival instincts completely hijacked his central nervous system. He didn't run, he exploded forward. Launching his body across the desk, Emmett tackled Isabel out of her hover chair just as a wave of kinetic force tore through the space where her head had been a moment prior. They hit the hard marble floor together. Emmett landed heavily on his left shoulder, a sharp, sickening pop echoed in his joint as the bone partially dislocated under the impact. He ignored it. He used his heavy, broad human frame to completely cover Isabel's slight, fragile body, shielding her from the falling stone and raining glass. The roar of the actual blast finally hit them, a deafening, absolute shockwave that rattled Emmett's teeth and brought thick, choking gray plaster dust raining down in sheets. Isabel was trembling violently beneath him, letting out a high-pitched, vibrating harmonic whine of pure panic. "Stay down. Don't breathe the air," Emmett rasped, his throat instantly coated in pulverized drywall and hot copper insulation dust. Through the ringing in his ears, a heavy, rhythmic sound began to approach. Crunch. 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 It was the sound of heavy boots walking over broken glass. But these weren't the soft-soled tactical boots of the Royal Palace Guards. Palace Guards moved like ghosts on marble. These steps were heavy, metallic, and carried the distinct magnetic clank of Void Runner mag boots. Through the swirling gray fog, 5 thick silhouettes materialized. They were clad in matte black, non-uniform composite armor. No insignia. No flags. In their hands, they held short-barreled, suppressed kinetic submachine guns. Mercenaries. Professional void rats. Emmett's mind scanned the room. He had no weapon. He hadn't touched a firearm since he walked away from the frontier campaigns. He was trapped under a broken oak desk, his left arm singing with white-hot dislocation pain. "Target secured," a gruff, filtered voice boomed through the dust. A massive wall of armor stepped forward. The name Boyd was stenciled faintly in scratched white paint across his chest plate. He looked down at Emmett with absolute indifference, his submachine gun aimed directly at the human's head. Emmett scrambled backward, putting his right hand up in a defensive, submissive gesture, trying to look as terrified and weak as possible. "Listen, wait. You don't want to do this, there's credits," Boyd didn't banter. He didn't hesitate. He simply stepped forward and swung the heavy steel stock of his rifle in a brutal downward arc. Emmett tried to slip the blow, a ghost of his old military reflexes twitching in his muscles, but his damaged left shoulder slowed him down by a millisecond. The steel stock caught him flush against the side of his skull. Pain exploded behind Emmett's eyes, a blinding, white-hot flash that smelled like burning copper. The world tilted violently on its axis, and he hit the floor, his cheek pressing into the cold, glass-strewn marble. Nausea rolled over him in a sickening wave as his vision began to tunnel. Through the narrowing blur of his sight, he saw the second mercenary step forward with predatory efficiency. The man reached under the desk, grabbed Isabel by the collar of her prized denim jacket, and dragged her out. She kicked, she scratched with her 4-fingered hands, her harmonic voice cracking into a terrifying, agonizing shriek. "Emmett! Emmett! Help me!" The mercenary didn't care. He slapped a small, silver neuropatch onto the side of her neck. In less than a second, Isabel's eyes rolled back, her body going completely limp as the sedative took over. He threw her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. "We've got the package," the lean mercenary barked into his comms. "We're on the clock. 2 minutes to local response." Boyd looked down at Emmett one last time. Emmett was lying in a growing pool of his own blood, his eyes dull, his breathing shallow. Boyd raised his heavy magnetic boot, aligning the heel right above Emmett's throat to finish the job. "Leave the trash, Boyd," the lean one shouted from the shattered wall. "Extract now. The grid is coming back up." Boyd grunted, lowering his foot with a cruel chuckle. Lucky day, teach. They turned and jogged into the dust, leaving the room behind. Emmett tried to speak. He tried to crawl. But only a thick, warm bubble of blood spilled past his lips. He watched the gray dust swirl in the empty space where the girl had just been. Then, the blackness crawled in from the edges of his eyes, and the world faded into a deep, heavy, terrifying silence. The mercenaries thought they left a dying schoolteacher in the ruins of the palace. They didn't realize they had just unlocked the cage of a monster who had spent 7 years trying to forget how to kill. And when Emmett's eyes opened in the dark, the math on their survival changed to 0. Coming back to consciousness was not a gentle process. It didn't feel like waking up, it felt like dragging a heavy, broken body upward through wet, freezing sand. Emmett gagged. His body convulsed on reflex as he rolled onto his right side, coughing up a thick mouthful of dark, metallic-tasting blood onto the pristine white marble. Every single beat of his heart felt like a sledgehammer striking the raw interior of his skull. The concussion was bad, the kind that makes the world spin even when your eyes are closed. He lay there for a long, agonizing moment, his entire frame shivering as the biting cold of the palace floor seeped straight into his bones. The atrium was dead silent now, save for one sound, the distant, rhythmic, warbling wail of the palace's emergency klaxons. It wasn't loud down here, but the frequency was a physical ache inside his ears. Slowly, using every ounce of his remaining willpower, Emmett pushed himself up into a sitting position. He reached up with his right hand, his fingers trembling as they brushed the side of his head. They came away dripping, wet, and sticky with dark, thick human blood. He didn't panic. He didn't swear. He simply wiped the blood onto his worn corduroy slacks, leaving a dark, ugly smear. Then, he looked at his left arm. It hung completely uselessly at his side, rotated slightly inward. The shoulder was completely out of its socket. Emmett gritted his teeth, a low, guttural, animalistic sound escaping from the back of his throat. He couldn't hunt with one arm. He couldn't slide a blade into a throat or stabilize a rifle with one hand. He slowly crawled across the glass-strewn floor, dragging his useless arm behind him, until he reached the heavy, solid oak leg of his overturned teaching desk. He braced his back against the wood. He took his left wrist with his right hand and wedged it tightly into the deep crook where the desk leg met the tabletop. He took one ragged, deep breath that tasted entirely of drywall dust and ash. Then, he twisted his entire torso violently to the right. Snap! A wet, sickening crunch echoed through the empty atrium. Emmett screamed, a raw, agonizing sound that was cut short as he collapsed onto his back, panting heavily, cold sweat instantly drenching his button-down shirt. His vision went entirely white for 3 seconds. He lay there, staring up at the shattered ceiling, letting the waves of blinding pain wash over him. He welcomed the pain. He needed it. The agony was a chemical fire, burning away the thick, suffocating fog of the concussion. For 7 long years, Emmett had tried to be soft. He had bought civilian clothes, read poetry, and learned how to smile at people who didn't deserve it. He had buried the man who had survived the mud and the meat grinders of the Proxima campaigns, the monster who knew exactly how many seconds it took for a being to bleed out if you severed their brachial artery in the pitch black. He had done all of it to protect whatever piece of his soul was left. Lucky day, teach, Boyd's voice echoed in his memory. Emmett closed his eyes. In the deepest, darkest corner of his mind, a heavy, rusted iron door creaked open. He didn't want to open it. God knew he didn't. But Isabel was gone. The palace guards were either dead or incompetent. And the local authorities were bureaucratic fools who would spend the next 3 hours negotiating ransom terms while those mercenaries sold the girl to an off-world syndicate. When Emmett opened his eyes again, the tired, slouching academic was entirely gone. His facial muscles went completely slack. His breathing slowed down to a rhythmic, calculated mechanical pace. The panic, the fear, the hesitation, vanished. They were replaced by a cold, terrifyingly sharp military clarity. He stood up. His balance swayed violently for a split second, but he forced his thigh muscles to lock, anchoring himself to the floor. He walked out of the ruined atrium, his footsteps completely silent now despite the broken glass beneath his leather boots. He wasn't walking like a civilian anymore, he was gliding, keeping his center of gravity low. In the main corridor, he found his first resource. It was a royal palace guard. The boy couldn't have been older than 22, a local planetary recruit. His ornamental, high-polished silver armor was useless, punched clean through by 3 heavy, high-velocity kinetic rounds. His eyes were wide, staring blankly at the vaulted ceiling in a permanent expression of shock. Emmett knelt beside him. He reached out with a strange, gentle reverence and closed the boy's eyelids with 2 fingers. "Sleep, kid," he whispered. Then, his hands moved with practiced, terrifyingly efficient speed. He unclipped the guard's tactical rig. He pulled out the sidearm, a standard-issue, high-capacity kinetic pistol. He checked the magazine. Full. He racked the slide. Clack clack. The metallic sound was something he hadn't heard in nearly a decade, yet his muscle memory welcomed it like an old, toxic friend. The weight of the grip in his palm felt entirely too natural. He stripped the guard's tactical harness completely, pulling the black straps over his own bloody, torn academic shirt. He searched the pouches, 2 extra magazines, a 7-inch carbon steel combat knife, and a small, handheld environmental diagnostic scanner. Emmett powered up the scanner, his fingers flying across the interface. He dragged a thick, black data cable from the scanner and jammed it directly into a compromised wall terminal. The palace mainframe was in a hard military lockdown, but the secondary environmental sensors, the ones that regulated oxygen and temperature, were still pinging data to the substations. He bypassed the security firewalls using a dirty encryption splice trick he'd learned from a trench tech splicer during his 3rd tour of duty. The screen flickered, glowing a pale blue against his bloody face. He pulled up the localized atmospheric data for the last 10 minutes. There. 5 distinct thermal signatures, heavily weighted, meaning they were carrying gear and a hostage. They weren't heading up toward the roof pad where a ship could be shot down by palace defense grids. They were heading down. Deep down. They were utilizing the old subterranean maintenance tunnels, making a direct run for the lower city's unregulated spaceport. It was a smart play. No cameras, no automated security grids, and a direct, unmonitored pipeline to the underworld docking bays. Emmett unplugged the scanner and tucked it into his harness. He looked down at his right hand. It was trembling slightly. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline, the violent, predatory chemistry of the human body waking up from a long hibernation, flooding his bloodstream with massive doses of cortisol and norepinephrine. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing to feel again. He gripped the pistol tighter, turning his cold eyes toward the heavy service elevator doors at the end of the hall. The mercenaries think the dark tunnels are their escape route. They don't know that the darkness doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the man who is currently descending the elevator shaft, and he is coming to balance the ledger. The descent into the underworld was agonizingly slow. The service elevator car was a rusted, vibrating metal box, bathing Emmett in a sickly, flickering red emergency glow. He stood perfectly still in the center of the platform, the heavy kinetic pistol held low against his thigh. He didn't check the weapon again, doing so was a civilian's nervous tick, and Emmett had no room left for nerves. Instead, he drew the 7-inch carbon steel combat knife from his tactical harness. The gun was a backup for now. Down in the narrow, reinforced concrete veins of the palace's underbelly, gunfire was an invitation to a meat grinder. The sound would bounce off the walls, the flash would blind you in the dark, and a stray kinetic round could ricochet off the steel piping and tear through your own throat. Silence wasn't just a preference, it was a survival metric. The elevator gears ground to a heavy, shivering halt. The doors slid apart with a high-pitched, metallic groan. The air down here was entirely different from the pristine, mint-scented atrium above. It was thick, warm, and stagnant, smelling heavily of raw ammonia, industrial grease, and the sharp, chemical tang of high-pressure coolant leaks. It was dark, illuminated only by widely spaced, amber sodium bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows down the sweating concrete corridor. Emmett stepped out. He didn't walk, he glided. He kept his weight balanced on the outsides of his boots, rolling each step from heel to toe to eliminate the sound of shifting leather against gravel. The white-hot pain in his left shoulder had subsided into a dull, heavy throb, successfully walled off by a massive surge of natural painkillers. His senses began to expand, mapping the dark. He heard the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of a leaky pipe 40 yards ahead. He heard the distant, low-frequency hum of a primary sector generator. And then, he heard what he was hunting for, the heavy, wet splash of a boot hitting a shallow puddle, and the faint, distinct squeak of military-grade tactical nylon shifting against armor plates. They had left a rear guard. Emmett pressed his back against the damp, algae-slicked concrete wall of the tunnel. He breathed exclusively through his mouth, shallow, slow, and measured, preventing the sound of air rushing through his nasal passages. He peered around the corner, his vision adjusting effortlessly to the gloom. 2 mercenaries stood at a primary power junction box roughly 40 yards down the corridor. They were professional, but they were relaxed, a fatal mistake when operating against a Terran. One mercenary was facing forward, watching the dark corridor leading toward the lower city spaceport. The other, the lean one who had physically dragged Isabel from under the desk, was looking back toward the elevator, holding a short-barreled submachine gun at the low ready. Emmett's eyes locked onto the lean one. A cold, sharp spike of hatred flared in his chest, but he instantly smothered it. Anger made your hands shake. Anger made you rush. In the trenches, anger got you killed. He analyzed the environment with cold geometry. The tunnel was too open, a direct approach would get him spotted, and their composite plates would easily deflect a low-caliber pistol round from that distance. He needed to be closer. He needed to be above. He looked up. Running along the upper curve of the ceiling was a narrow, metal maintenance ledge used for servicing the high-voltage power cables. It was shrouded in absolute shadow, completely missed by the amber sodium lights below. Emmett holstered the knife. He reached up, his fingers gripping the cold iron lip of the overhead ledge. He pulled his body upward. The vertical jolt sent a blinding spear of agony straight through his newly reset left shoulder. His vision went completely white for a fraction of a second, and a tiny, breathless gasp escaped his lips. It was barely a whisper, but in the echoing silence of the concrete vault, it sounded like a gunshot. Down the tunnel, the lean mercenary's head snapped toward the sound. "Hold up, Miller," he muttered, his voice filtered through his helmet's external comms. "You hear that?" Miller, a stocky man chewing on a synthetic stimulant root, didn't lift his eyes from the junction box. "Hear what, Hayes?" "It's a damn sewer system. The whole place is settling after the blast." "No, I heard a scuff," Hayes insisted. He raised his short-barreled rifle, stepping away from the wall. He clicked on his underbarrel tactical light. A blinding, tight beam of white light sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the concrete floor, splashing over the green slime on the walls, and rising slowly up toward the ceiling. It crept closer and closer to the narrow ledge where Emmett was currently pressing his chest flat against the iron grating, holding his breath. The light stopped barely 2 inches from Emmett's boots. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, a heavy, rhythmic thudding he was certain the mercenaries could hear. Sweat mixed with the dried blood on his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. He didn't move a single muscle. "Nothing," Hayes finally said, clicking the light off and plunging the upper tunnel back into darkness. "Fucking colony rats, probably." "Relax, man," Miller grunted, securing a piece of gray hardware to the junction box. Boyd's already at the primary extraction point with the package. We hold this junction for 3 more minutes, prime the thermite to blow the tunnel behind us, and we get our payout. 3 minutes. Emmett didn't give them 3 minutes. He began to crawl along the iron ledge, moving inch by agonizing inch like a hunting spider. The rough concrete of the upper wall scraped against his chest, tearing the remaining fabric of his academic shirt, but he felt nothing. He counted the distance in his head, matching his movements to the rhythmic dripping of the water below until he was directly above them. He looked down through the iron slats. Hayes was standing directly beneath him, his back completely exposed. Miller was 10 feet away, his hands busy wiring the detonator into the palace power lines. This wasn't going to be a clean, cinematic strike. It was going to be close, ugly, and heavy. Emmett silently drew the carbon steel knife with his right hand. He swung his legs over the edge of the iron grating, dangling into the open air, and he let go. He didn't yell. He didn't grunt. He dropped the 10 feet in absolute, terrifying silence. His boots struck Hayes squarely on the shoulders. The kinetic force of a 200-pound human dropping from that height was devastating. Hayes's collarbones snapped instantly with a loud, wet crunch. And the air was blasted from his lungs as he crumpled to the floor under Emmett's weight. Before Hayes could even process the impact, Emmett's left hand clamped brutally over the mercenary's helmet visor, tilting his head back to expose the unarmored throat gap beneath the chin piece. With his right hand, Emmett drove the combat knife upward, sliding the blade effortlessly into the soft flesh, angling it straight up into the brain stem. Hayes convulsed violently. A hot, heavy spray of arterial blood coated Emmett's right hand and wrist. The mercenary's heavy boots kicked frantically against the concrete in a dying spasm, but Emmett held him down with his entire weight, pinning the thrashing body to the floor while his cold eyes locked onto Miller. Miller spun around at the sound of the wet scuffle, his jaw dropping behind his tactical visor. Through the dim amber light, he saw his partner twitching on the floor, pinned beneath a blood-soaked man wearing the torn, dusty rags of an academic outfit. What the foo? Miller scrambled to raise his weapon, but panic made his fingers clumsy. Emmett ripped the knife free from Hayes's throat, grabbed the high-capacity kinetic pistol from his own harness, and threw his body forward into a dead sprint. Miller's rifle is coming up, his finger is on the trigger, and Emmett has no cover left in the narrow hall. But the human animal is already mid-stride, and he doesn't intend to let the mercenary pull it. Miller didn't get to finish the curse. Emmett didn't try to aim down the iron sights of his pistol. At this distance, accuracy was a matter of momentum, not alignment. He tackled Miller around the waist, driving his right shoulder directly into the stocky mercenary's midsection with the force of a freight train. As they collided, Miller's finger clamped down on his rifle's trigger. The short-barreled submachine gun roared, firing a blind, deafening burst of fully automatic suppressing fire. The rounds missed Emmett by inches, chewing into the concrete ceiling directly above them and showering the narrow tunnel in blinding white sparks and a rain of pulverized stone. They hit the floor together, rolling violently into a shallow, filthy puddle of stagnant maintenance water. The splash echoed off the concrete walls as the water instantly turned dark and turbid with mud, plaster dust, and fresh blood. Miller was strong, built like a safe and hardened by years of low-gravity brawling. Before Emmett could pin his arms, Miller swung a heavy, composite-armored gauntlet in a brutal backhand arc crack. The armored fist caught Emmett flush across the left side of his face. His head snapped back violently, his vision exploding into a swimming sea of gray and crimson as a fresh, jagged gash tore open over his left eyebrow. Blood instantly began to pour into his eye, blinding him on one side. Miller scrambled desperately to bring his rifle barrel down, trying to align the muzzle with Emmett's chest. Emmett didn't waste time trying to block the weapon with his hands. Instead, he shoved his left forearm directly into the rifle's path, jamming his flesh and bone against the weapon's receiver. The metal burned into his skin, but it kept the muzzle pointed away from his vital organs. With his right hand, Emmett brought his heavy kinetic pistol up, reversed his grip, and began slamming the solid steel slide down into the side of Miller's tactical helmet. Crunch. The first strike cracked the outer polymer layer. Miller grunted, slightly stunned. Crunch. The second strike shattered the internal HUD matrix, sending a shower of tiny, blue electrical sparks across Miller's face. Miller roared in a mixture of panic and rage. Dropping the pinned rifle, he reached up with his massive, bare, thick-fingered hands and clamped them directly around Emmett's throat. The grip was absolute. It was a crushing, hydraulic pressure that instantly flattened Emmett's windpipe, completely cutting off his air supply. The tunnel began to spin. The amber sodium lights overhead stretched into long, bleeding lines of fire. Emmett's lungs screamed for oxygen, burning from the inside out. His left arm, already weakened by the torn ligaments from the earlier dislocation, flopped uselessly against Miller's chest plates. Emmett didn't try to pry Miller's heavy hands away from his neck. That was what a civilian would do, wasting precious strength against a superior grip. Instead, Emmett leaned into the choke, using the last of his fading consciousness to target a vulnerability. He raised his right hand, extended his fingers into rigid claws, and drove his thumb straight through the shattered, jagged opening of Miller's broken helmet visor. He gouged viciously, targeting the soft, unprotected flesh of the mercenary's eyes. Miller shrieked, a raw, high-pitched, agonizing scream of pure horror that echoed like a dying animal through the subterranean transit lines. His hands immediately released Emmett's throat, snapping back to claw frantically at his own ruined face. Emmett collapsed onto his chest, gasping for air, his throat making a horrific, dry clicking sound as his lungs desperately pulled in the stagnant, chemical-laden tunnel air. He didn't hesitate. Reaching blindly into the mud of the puddle beneath him, his fingers wrapped around the handle of the carbon steel combat knife he had dropped during the scramble. With a low, guttural grunt, Emmett drove the 7-inch blade upward, sliding it deep into the soft, unarmored joint of Miller's armor right under the armpit. He twisted the blade 90 degrees, severing the primary arteries beneath the shoulder. Miller's screaming stopped instantly. He let out a wet, bubbling gasp, his entire body going rigid for a brief second before slumping sideways into the muddy water with a heavy, final splash. The tunnel returned to silence, broken only by the persistent drip of the overhead pipes and the harsh, ragged, desperate rasp of Emmett's own breathing. Emmett lay there on his side for a long time. He was soaked to the bone in cold sewer water, grease, and hot mercenary blood. The air around him smelled of ruptured drywall, burnt gunpowder, and the heavy, unmistakable copper scent of violent death. Slowly, he pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. His hands were shaking violently now, worse than before. The primal, predatory human animal had finished its kill, and the inevitable chemical hangover was setting in. The massive rush of adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving his nervous system raw, cold, and exhausted. He wiped his face with a bloody sleeve, smearing the mud and gore across his features into a terrifying, skeletal mask. He stood up, his legs feeling like hollow pillars of lead. He picked up Miller's dropped submachine gun. It was heavier than his pistol, beautifully balanced, and custom-tuned. He checked the magazine, nearly full, wiped a layer of gray plaster dust from the receiver, and slung the tactical strap over his right shoulder. Then, he walked back to Hayes's body. He knelt down in the dark, his blood-soaked fingers fishing into one of the dead man's tactical pouches until they clicked against a small, silver device. It was an encrypted, short-range military comms earpiece. Emmett wiped the dark smear of blood off the plastic speaker and pushed it deep into his right ear canal. Immediately, the static hissed, followed by a deep, filtered baritone that made Emmett's jaw lock. It was Boyd. "Hey, Miller. Status report. The charge is set. We're loading the asset onto the transport skiff now. The grid's clear. Talk to me." Emmett reached up to his ear. He pressed the small, rubber transmit button on the side of the earpiece. He didn't say a word. He didn't threaten them, and he didn't demand the girl back. He simply held the button down, letting the microphone pick up the slow, heavy, echoing drip, drip. Drip of the contaminated water hitting the puddle where the two dead men lay. For 3 long seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the water. Then, on the other end of the line, Boyd's voice lost its arrogant, confident edge. The mercenary sounded suddenly sharp, his tone dropping an octave. Hayes. Miller. Talk to me. What's that noise? Emmett clicked the radio off, severing the connection. He stood up, his dead, hollow eyes staring down the dark, open tunnel ahead. He wasn't the gentle tutor anymore. The men in the hangar ahead had taken something under his protection. They had assumed a soft target. And now, they were about to learn exactly why humanity was universally feared in the deep black. Boyd knows something is wrong in the dark, but he thinks he's safe inside his armored transport. He has no idea that the man walking toward him doesn't care about armor, doesn't care about numbers, and doesn't plan on leaving any survivors. The air in the subterranean transit tunnel slowly shifted as Emmett dragged his battered body forward. The oppressive, suffocating reek of stagnant water and raw sewage gradually gave way to the sharp, chemical bite of high-grade promethium fuel and scorched ozone. He was getting close to the undercity grid. Emmett leaned his back against the damp, curved concrete wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. His left shoulder burned with a deep, sickening heat, a constant, pulsing reminder of the torn ligaments and the brutal, raw relocation he had forced upon his own joint. His hands, caked in drying blood and black industrial grease, gripped the stolen submachine gun. The metal receiver was cold, unforgiving, and comfortably heavy. Ahead, the narrow tunnel finally widened, opening up into a cavernous, forgotten subterranean loading bay. The space was a cathedral of rusted iron and cracked plastisteel, illuminated by harsh, buzzing halogen work lights suspended from a vaulted ceiling 50 feet above. Through the soles of Emmett's worn leather boots, a persistent, low-frequency hum vibrated. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy repulsor drive warming up. Sitting in the center of the concrete deck was a smuggling skiff. It was matte black, stripped of all identifying civilian markings or transponder tags, its heavy hydraulic boarding ramp lowered like a waiting tongue over the oil-stained floor. Emmett pressed his bruised, bloody cheek against the cold concrete of the tunnel exit, letting his right eye trace the perimeter of the hangar with absolute tactical precision. The adrenaline dump from his fight with Miller was fading fast, leaving behind a profound, aching exhaustion that threatened to buckle his knees. He had to finish this now, before his body completely betrayed him. He counted the variables. There were 2 men visible outside the ship. The first was a tall, heavily tattooed mercenary named Finn. He stood casually at the base of the boarding ramp, his helmet off, a synthetic cigarette glowing a bright cherry red between his lips. The thin plume of smoke drifted upward, catching the harsh glare of the halogen lights. His heavy kinetic rifle hung loosely on a single-point tactical sling across his chest armor. He wasn't on alert, he was waiting. The second man, Cross, was systematically sweeping the outer perimeter of the hangar. A bulky, glowing thermal scanner was held in his left hand, while his sidearm was drawn in his right. His heavy boots crunched rhythmically on the scattered, loose gravel of the deck. Boyd was nowhere to be seen. That meant he was already inside the belly of the skiff with Isabel. Emmett wiped a mixture of sweat and dark blood from his brow, smearing the grime across his face until his features resembled a terrifying, hollow-eyed skull. He checked the fire selector switch on the submachine gun. Full auto. He couldn't afford a prolonged, tactical firefight in a space this open. The hangar offered no mid-ground cover once he stepped out of the tunnel mouth. If they pinned him down, their superior numbers and military-grade armor would tear his civilian rags to shreds. He needed to be violent. He needed to be sudden. He needed to be absolutely devastating. Emmett waited, his breathing perfectly synced to the hum of the ship's engine. He watched Cross sweep the thermal scanner toward the far, dark side of the hangar, effectively turning his back to the tunnel entrance. Now. Emmett stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run. Running ruined your aim and drew the eye through sudden movement. He walked. His steps were smooth, fluid, and rolling, planting his heel first and absorbing the impact in his knees to keep the muzzle of his weapon perfectly level. The submachine gun was tucked tight against his right shoulder, his left hand gripping the barrel shroud, completely ignoring the searing, white-hot agony that shot through his injured shoulder joint. He sighted on Finn first. The man at the ramp had the heavier primary rifle and a direct line of sight. At 30 yards, Emmett pulled the trigger. The submachine gun roared, a deafening, mechanical clatter that echoed violently off the iron walls of the hangar like thunder in an enclosed space. The recoil pushed hard against his bruised collarbone. The first 3 rounds caught Finn squarely in the chest, sparking brightly as they shattered against his thick composite armor plates. Finn stumbled back, his eyes widening in shock as his cigarette flew from his mouth. His hands scrambled frantically for the grip of his slung rifle. But Emmett didn't stop firing. He smoothly dragged the barrel upward, correcting for the vertical muzzle climb. The next automatic burst tore through the unprotected gap beneath Finn's jaw, ripping through his throat and teeth. A dark red mist blossomed under the glaring halogen lights. Finn didn't even have the breath to scream. He collapsed backward against the hydraulic struts of the boarding ramp, sliding down the metal grating and leaving a thick, wet smear of crimson behind him. The echoing gunfire hadn't even faded from the rafters before Cross spun around, his boots skidding on the gravel. Contact! Cross roared, dropping his thermal scanner. The expensive device shattered on the concrete deck, its screen fracturing into spiderwebs of blue light. Cross brought his sidearm up with professional speed, firing rapidly. The heavy kinetic round struck the floor near Emmett's feet, sending sharp, jagged chips of shattered stone flying through the air. One tiny, razor-sharp shard sliced a hot line straight across Emmett's right cheek. Emmett didn't flinch. He didn't feel it. He dove hard to the right, throwing his body behind a rusted stack of empty promethium fuel barrels just as a cluster of bullets hammered into the metal. Clang! 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 The deafening impacts rang inside Emmett's ears like a church bell. Cross was already advancing, firing in a rhythmic, controlled pattern to keep Emmett suppressed behind the thin metal barriers. "I got you pinned, you rat!" Cross yelled, his voice thick with a sudden, desperate mixture of panic and rage. "Boyd! Boyd, we got a breach out here. Get the ship moving." Emmett knelt in the dirt behind the barrels, his teeth bared in a snarl. He squeezed the trigger of his submachine gun to return fire, but the weapon let out a hollow, empty click. The bolt locked back. He was out of ammo. He had no extra magazines. Dropping the useless firearm onto the concrete, Emmett reached down to his thigh and drew the 7-inch carbon steel combat knife. The blade was still sticky and dark with Miller's blood. The heavy crunch of footsteps was getting closer. Cross was moving tactically, sweeping wide to flank the barrels and catch him defenseless. Emmett closed his eyes, tuning out the echoes of the hangar, focusing entirely on the crunch of gravel. 5 yards. 4 yards. 3. Cross thinks he's clearing a corner against a helpless, outgunned civilian. He has no idea that the man waiting behind the fuel barrels isn't hiding from the bullets, he's just waiting for the distance to close. Emmett didn't wait to be flanked. He didn't wait for Cross's boots to round the edge of the rusted fuel barrels. Before the mercenary could establish a clear line of sight, Emmett exploded outward from the opposite side of the stack, staying incredibly low to the ground. His body cutting through the swirling dust like a predatory cat. Cross was caught completely off guard by the sudden, aggressive change in direction. Expecting a cowering target hiding behind the metal, he swung his heavy pistol downward in pure reflex, firing a blind, panicked shot. Crack! The high-velocity kinetic round grazed Emmett's ribs, instantly tearing through the blood-soaked rags of his shirt and shearing away a clean layer of skin and fat. The pain was a white-hot iron rod pressed against his torso, but the sheer momentum of his forward charge carried him through. He didn't slow down. He didn't even draw a breath. Emmett slammed his right shoulder directly into Cross's knees with the force of a battering ram. The larger mercenary grunted, his legs buckling instantly under the sudden impact. They crashed hard onto the unforgiving concrete deck together in a chaotic tangle of limbs, tactical nylon, and shattered stone. Cross's pistol fired blindly again as they rolled, the bullet ricocheting violently off the high iron ceiling above, sending a rain of brilliant orange sparks down upon them. Emmett scrambled upward, throwing his weight over Cross's chest, trying to bring the carbon steel knife down into the throat. But Cross was fighting with the desperate, frantic panic of an animal that knows it's being cornered by an apex predator. He didn't try to aim the gun, instead, he smashed his heavy, composite-armored gauntlet straight into Emmett's face. Crunch. Emmett's nose shattered instantly. The world behind his eyes exploded into a blinding constellation of white-hot stars, and thick, dark blood instantly flooded his throat, hot and choking. He staggered, his grip slipping. Cross seized the moment. He pinned Emmett's right knife arm against the floor with his knee, reaching up with his thick, scarred fingers to wrap them entirely around Emmett's throat. "Die, you piece of shit!" Cross spat, his saliva hitting the mask of grime and blood on Emmett's face. The grip tightened brutally, crushing the windpipe. Emmett's lungs burned, his vision rapidly tunneling into a suffocating blackness. His left arm, practically paralyzed from the torn shoulder ligaments, flopped weakly against Cross's thick chest plates. He was out of leverage. He was out of air. He was out of traditional options. So, he stopped fighting the chokehold. He let his body go slightly limp, causing Cross to lean in closer to ensure the kill. Then, using the very last ounce of his primitive, frantic human survival strength, Emmett snapped his head forward. He bared his teeth and buried them viciously into the raw, exposed flesh of Cross's wrist, right in the narrow, soft gap between the mercenary's armor plate and his tactical glove. He didn't just bite, he clamped his jaws with the absolute, bone-crushing force of a starving wolf, tearing through the skin and severing the tendons beneath. Cross shrieked, a raw, high-pitched scream of pure, unadulterated agony that echoed through the rafters as he instinctively yanked his arm back. The brutal chokehold broke. Emmett heaved his hips upward with a guttural roar, bucking the heavier man entirely off balance. Ripping his right arm free from beneath Cross's knee, Emmett drove the combat knife upward in a fierce, blind arc. The 7-inch blade found its mark, the soft, unarmored seals right beneath Cross's armpit. It slid deeply into the mercenary's rib cage, piercing through the lung with a wet, heavy slide. Cross gasped, his eyes going wide and vacant behind his tactical visor. He tried to speak, to call for his commander, but only a wet, frothy bubble of dark blood spilled past his lips. His heavy, armored body slumped forward, pinning Emmett to the concrete deck beneath his dead weight. Emmett lay there for a long moment, crushed under the corpse, staring blankly up at the buzzing halogen lights. He spat out a mouthful of blood and a piece of torn flesh. He was trembling violently, his entire body a unified, screaming chorus of agony. His left arm was completely numb now, his ribs felt like they were on fire, and his nose was a throbbing, swollen ruin. With a strained, agonizing groan, he shoved Cross's heavy corpse off his chest and rolled onto his hands and knees, coughing up dark, clotted blood onto the floor. 2 down. Only 1 left. Emmett forced his legs to lock, pushing himself up into a standing position that felt entirely unnatural. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing the fresh gore across his forehead like war paint. He looked down at the deck. Resting near Cross's limp hand was a massive, brutal weapon, a 6-round rotary hand cannon, built for heavy kinetic destruction at close range. Emmett knelt and picked it up. The weight was immense, but it felt stable. He flipped the cylinder open with a practiced flick of his wrist. 3 rounds left. More than enough for what he needed to do. He turned his cold, dead gaze toward the matte black smuggling skiff. The heavy hydraulic boarding ramp was still lowered, resting silently on the oil-slicked floor. Dragging his right leg slightly behind him, Emmett began to walk toward the ship. The hangar was completely silent now, save for the low, vibrating hum of the repulsor drive and the rhythmic drop. Drop, drop of blood falling from his chin onto the cold concrete. Emmett is standing at the base of the ramp, a broken, bleeding shadow of a man holding a half-empty hand cannon. But as heavy footsteps echo from inside the cargo hold, the true monster of the ship steps into the light, and he's holding Emmett's only reason to stay alive. "That's far enough," a voice boomed from the deep shadows of the skiff's cargo hold. It was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of fear. Heavy magnetic boots clanked sharply against the metal structure of the ramp. Boyd stepped forward, moving directly into the harsh, buzzing glare of the halogen lights. He looked like a walking dreadnought. His heavy combat armor was thick with reactive plating, scarred, pitted, and scorched from countless frontier skirmishes on the outer rim. In his right hand, he held a massive automatic shotgun, the wide barrel resting casually against his hip. And in his left hand, suspended entirely by the collar of her ruined denim jacket, was Princess Isabel. Her feet dangled inches off the metal deck. She was conscious, but barely. Her pale, four-fingered hands weakly clawed at Boyd's massive, armored wrist, her milky secondary eyelids flickering rapidly in pure terror. But when her eyes landed on the figure standing at the base of the ramp, her breath hitched. She didn't see the gentle, slouching human academic who corrected her posture and patiently explained the nuances of interplanetary tariffs. She saw a living nightmare. Emmett was soaked from head to toe in gore, his clothes torn to rags, his face a swollen, bloody mask of primitive, prehistoric violence. "Emmett!" She choked out, her harmonic voice a fragile, broken whisper. Boyd looked past Emmett, his eyes scanning the quiet hangar, taking in the limp, lifeless bodies of Finn and Cross. Then, he looked back at the lone human standing before him. A low, rumbling chuckle vibrated inside the mercenaries' chest plates. "Well, I'll be damned," Boyd said, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "The tutor. I should have caved your skull in when I had the chance back in the atrium. Who the hell are you? You ain't no school teacher." Emmett stopped at the very base of the ramp. He stood barely 10 feet away from the giant. He didn't raise the heavy rotary hand cannon, he just let it hang loosely by his side, his knuckles split and dripping. His breathing was a harsh, ragged, metallic rasp. "Let the girl go, Boyd," Emmett said. His voice didn't sound like his own anymore. It was a dry, hollow scrape, like two massive stones grinding together in the dark. "Or what?" Boyd sneered, smoothly lifting the massive shotgun and aiming the wide muzzle straight at Emmett's head. "You're bleeding out, pal. You look like you're about to fall over just from the weight of your own damn boots. You took out my boys, I'll give you that. Impressive, really. But you're way out of your weight class now. I'm taking this alien payout, and I'm leaving you here to rot in the grease." Emmett swayed slightly on his feet, his weight shifting to his uninjured leg. He stared directly into Boyd's tinted visor with dead, hollow eyes. "The logistics," Emmett rasped, his voice dropping an octave. "They were flawed." Boyd frowned, his finger tightening slightly on the shotgun's trigger. "What the fuck are you talking about?" "You assumed uniform resistance," Emmett said, his tone perfectly flat, devoid of any human emotion. "You assumed a soft civilian target. You didn't do the math on the local variables, Boyd. You didn't check who was in the room." Boyd's face hardened behind his visor. The mocking amusement instantly vanished, replaced by a cold mercenary instinct. "Math class is over, teach." Emmett didn't dive for cover. He didn't try to outdraw the automatic shotgun. He knew his broken, battered body was too slow, his reflexes dulled by the massive physical trauma he had endured. He couldn't beat Boyd in a straight quick draw. Instead, Emmett raised the heavy rotary hand cannon with his right hand and pointed the barrel straight down, not at Boyd. but at the reinforced plastisteel grating of the hydraulic ramp directly between the mercenaries' magnetic boots. He pulled the trigger. Boom! The massive kinetic round struck the reinforced metal grating. It didn't penetrate the heavy plate, it shattered into fragments. But Emmett hadn't been aiming for the deck plates to breach them. He was targeting the high-pressure hydraulic line running directly beneath that specific section of the ramp, the primary line that controlled the skiff's heavy cargo locking mechanisms. The heavy bullet sheared clean through the pressurized metal casing. With an ear-splitting, screeching hiss, highly compressed, scalding hot hydraulic fluid erupted from the shattered grating in a blinding, geyser-like spray. The white-hot liquid blasted upward at over 1,000 pounds per square inch. Catching Boyd squarely under the chin, the exact vulnerable seam where his heavy chest plating met the lower seal of his tactical helmet. Boyd roared in absolute, agonizing horror. The scalding, pressurized fluid blinded him instantly, melting through the soft rubber insulation seals of his helmet and cooking the skin of his face and neck. The sudden, blinding agony forced him to drop Isabel. The automatic shotgun slipped from his unclasped fingers, clattering loudly against the metal deck. Boyd staggered backward, his massive hands clawing frantically at his own helmet, trying to rip the boiling metal cage off his face. Isabel hit the ramp, coughing and scrambling away in the grease. Emmett didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. Pushing off his back foot, fighting through the blinding, white-hot agony screaming in his torn ribs and leg, he threw his entire body forward. He crossed the remaining distance on pure, unadulterated adrenaline and tackled the blinded giant. They crashed backward onto the metal grating of the ramp together, a chaotic mess of screaming metal and heavy armor. Boyd was a massive wall of muscle, still thrashing wildly in pure panic as the fluid continued to sear his flesh. He was dangerous, even blind. But Emmett was already scrambling upward, crawling onto the giant's chest plates like a specter of death, his split knuckles tightening into heavy iron rocks. Boyd is pinned, his weapons are gone, and Emmett is sitting on his chest with his bare hands. The scholar has completely vanished, and the monster of Proxima Prime is about to deliver his final, devastating lesson. Emmett didn't have a knife left. He didn't have a gun. He had nothing but his bare, split knuckles and a reservoir of localized, prehistoric human hatred that had been locked away for 7 years. As Boyd thrashed beneath him, screaming from the white-hot fluid melting his skin, Emmett drove his right fist straight into the ruined, leaking seals of the mercenary's helmet. Crack. The impact split the skin across Emmett's knuckles to the bone, but he didn't feel it. He didn't care. He raised his hand and struck again. Crunch. Every single blow was a violent rejection of the peaceful life he had tried to build. It was an exhumation of the soldier he thought he had buried deep in the mud of Proxima Prime. Boyd was a decorated killer, a professional warlord of the Outer Rim, but he was operating on training and protocol. Emmett was operating on pure, unfiltered Terran wrath. He hit him again. And again. And again. He didn't stop swinging until his right hand was a shattered, bloody ruin of fractured bone and torn tendons. Underneath him, Boyd's frantic thrashing slowly began to slow. The mercenary's massive, armored arms fell uselessly to the metal grating of the ramp, twitching weakly before going completely still. The caved-in visor of his helmet was painted in a dark, thick crimson that didn't belong to Emmett. Slowly, the movement ceased entirely. The giant was dead. Emmett sat atop the massive armored corpse, his head hanging low between his shoulders, his chest heaving in violent, ragged gasps. The hangar had fallen back into a heavy, absolute silence, broken only by the high-pitched hiss of the ruptured hydraulic line and the idle, low-frequency thrum of the ship's repulsor drive. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, blood, and burnt polymer. Then, Emmett felt it, a small, timid, trembling touch on his right shoulder. His survival instincts flared instantly. Emmett flinched violently, his good arm snapping upward, his shattered fist cocked back to deliver a lethal strike to whatever was behind him. He stopped. His fist hovered barely an inch away from a pale, terrified face. Princess Isabel stood there, kneeling in the grease and dirt of the ramp. She was shivering violently, her prized denim jacket covered in gray plaster dust and dark hydraulic fluids. Her large, luminescent eyes were wide, staring at the unrecognizable, crushed mask of Boyd's face, and then shifting up to look at Emmett. She didn't see her gentle tutor anymore. She didn't see the man who carefully explained planetary trade balances. She saw a monster. She saw a butcher who had torn through an entire squad of elite mercenaries with nothing but raw, primitive human violence. But she didn't pull away. Slowly, awkwardly, her slender, four-fingered hands reached out. She wrapped her fragile arms around Emmett's broad, blood-soaked, shaking shoulders. She pressed her face against his torn, muddy shirt, her harmonic voice cracking into a tiny, trembling sob. "I'm sorry," she whispered into his chest, her vocal cords producing a beautiful, tragic layered chorus pedal sound. "I'm so sorry, Emmett. I called it boring. I didn't know." Emmett let his shattered fist drop. The terrifying, vacant look in his dead eyes slowly began to recede, the dark iron door in his mind dragging heavily shut once more. The adrenaline was completely gone now, and the full weight of his broken body crashed down upon him. He felt every torn ligament, every cracked rib, and the deep, throbbing concussion in his skull. Slowly, with an agonizing effort, he raised his left hand, his fingers trembling uncontrollably, and gently, awkwardly patted the back of her faded denim jacket. "It's okay, Isabel," he croaked. His voice was a dry, broken whisper, thick with his own blood and a profound, suffocating sorrow. He had wanted to keep this part of him dead. He had wanted her to never see it. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the cold, vibrating metal hull of the smuggling skiff. "We need to get back to the palace," he whispered into the dark, a faint, tired ghost of his old academic smile touching his split lips. "We haven't finished the poetry lesson. And you still need to learn how to properly steep the tea. If you loved this raw, gritty, and unforgettable HFY story, make sure to smash that like button right now to feed the algorithm and keep these human tales alive. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies, and don't forget to hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an upload from the galactic frontier." What did you think of Emmett's terrifying transformation? Would you have pushed the tutor this far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next adventure. Stay dangerous out there.